Welcome, whiskey theologians. This is Around the Word in Many Glasses. Today we'll be drinking Glenmorangie Original, and we'll be talking about Exodus chapters 11 through 15. So sit back, relax, pour yourself a drink. Let's get into this. So I'm really excited about the scotch I have today. It's Glenmorangie. It's a Highland single malt scotch, and this is the original. Is kind of like their baseline, and it's been on my list to try for a while. Not because I am expecting it to be particularly exciting. In fact, most of what I've seen about it, it's not supposed to be a very exciting whiskey, but it's supposed to be a good offering of what Highland Scotch can be. It's supposed to be really smooth, whatever that means. Easy drinking Scotch, and classic in all of those ways. And quite frankly, it's on the budget end, so I'm excited to give this a try. Do a little bit of a story about this one, however. I was getting ready to go get another whiskey. So you can see this is a new bottle. And I was between this and something else. And I was going back and forth. The price was about the same. They had both been on my list for a while, and I just could not decide for myself which one I wanted to do. And so I actually went on to Reddit. I'm on the Whiskey Tribe subreddit. And the Whiskey Tribe has 2 YouTube channels. They might have more. Quite frankly, most of my whiskey knowledge comes from those guys and reading articles, also the backs of boxes and things like that. They're really awesome. Go check them out if you want to know about whiskey. It's the Whiskey Tribe and the Whiskey Vault are their 2 channels. Whiskey Vault does more reviews, talking about whiskeys in general, and the Whiskey Tribe is kind of them just having a good time with their whiskeys. But anyway, I posted on this subreddit asking the Whiskey Tribe, what should I get? I'm between these 2, and I don't know which one to buy. The reviews came in, and ended up getting this one, partly because of what one of the individuals on this Reddit, I've never met this guy before, don't even know if it was a guy, it could have been a woman for all I know. He said, go with the Glenmorangie if they have the Discovery set, is what they call it. And what it is for a few dollars more. I mean, it actually was still less than the other whiskey I was looking at. You get the full bottle of Glenmorangie, but you also get their 2 50 milliliter bottles, one of their 12-year and one of their 14-year. And from what I understand, what they've done at Glenmorangie is they have put exactly the same mash bill into barrels. So it's exactly the same liquids going into these barrels, but then they change things up from there so that you can kind of see how different lengths of time in barrels. I don't know if they move the barrels around. I haven't looked into the other 2 minis yet, but you can compare and see how that really affects the whiskey over time. And I thought that sounded like a lot of fun, so I ended up getting the Discovery set. I'm torn, though. I don't know whether or not to do comparisons between this and the other ones I got in the Discovery set on camera, or just do them all on my own. So I don't know. We'll see how I'm feeling to see if the 12-year and the 14-year get on. By the way, this is a 10-year whiskey. That means that if you're new to whiskey, age statements kind of only get you as far as they do, which I know is a great, worthwhile sentence. In essence, don't buy a whiskey just because it has a big number on it. It can mean all sorts of different things. Ask someone if you're new to get into whiskey. I've recommended a few that I've really enjoyed. Go onto the Whiskey Tribe subreddit. They're really friendly there. They got a great sense of humor, and you can just post and ask, what should I get? I want to try this type of whiskey, and you'll get all sorts of suggestions. And usually it'll be stuff that isn't big name, which means that you're paying for what's in the bottle rather than the label that's on the front of it, which whenever possible I try and avoid paying for labels because labels don't taste good. So that's enough of that. Let's give it a try. It's definitely not the most exciting whiskey. There's not a ton of stuff going on. It starts out sweet, which I was expecting, partly because it's a Highland, and it's not one of these big, bold flavors. It doesn't bill itself as that. And partly because I read the tasting notes on the box that it came in, and they said to expect pear, peach, and lemon, I think were what they said. And they mentioned sweetness. I think honey was in the list as well. I'm not sure if I really get it. Maybe pear and peach, a little bit. It's kind of a bright, fruity sweetness at the beginning, and then kind of finishes off in what is to me a very classic Highland kind of Scotch. And so the first couple of Scotches I ever had all had this kind of finishing note. I know exactly what it is. I can pick it out, but I don't know how to describe it. They described it as honey, vanilla, and something else. And I think that's probably there. It's not the same sort of vanilla caramely thing you get out of a bourbon. And it's not... I'm not sure if I'd say it's really honey, but... Yeah, I can see it. I don't know if I would have been able to pick it out on my own, but I'm also not great at picking out flavors. It helps to have a tasting guide. For me, at least. I know there are people who don't need them, who you can hand them a glass of something, they can match the notes that are given. People that are really good at this. The Whiskey Tribe, I think it was, they did something like that recently. They had everywhere from people who almost never had any whiskeys to their sommeliers that they have on site, blind tasting whiskeys, and it was interesting. So you should, if you're interested, go check that out. Like I said, they're a lot of fun on that channel. Would I recommend it? I think so. I think for similar money, I would go with the Glenmorangie. I think it's, I don't know, maybe that's just me. Also, I'm not 100% sure if Glenmorangie is a Highland. I purchased it for the first time before I paid any attention to that, so I don't know exactly what Glenmorangie is. That was the first whiskey I had on this channel, so definitely go check that one. I would 100% recommend that one, and I'd recommend it over this one. They're about the same price point, but it's good. I'm currently enjoying it. We'll see how it goes over time, if it rises or falls in how much I'm enjoying it. But good, absolutely nothing wrong with it. If you're new to Scotch, it's a good place to start. Again, I think for the money, I'd go with the Glenmorangie over the Glenmorangie, or Glenmorangie. I'm sure I'm going to miss... I don't think I've mentioned this. I'm going to mispronounce the names of whiskeys, particularly Scotches. And I have an Irish whiskey on deck. I think I know how to pronounce the name of it, but I'm taking a shot in the dark. So try not to hold that too much against me when I don't know how to pronounce the name of the Scotches or the whiskeys or anything like that. Because some of these have, at least to my ear, very difficult names to pronounce. I just don't know how their alphabet is working to make the noises that are supposed to be produced. But cheers to mispronouncing the names of whiskeys. Do you know that this is Glenmorangie? Yeah, I've heard people say the name of it. Just, I don't know. My brain doesn't always compute straight out when I'm just pronouncing it. So it is Glenmorangie, if you're interested. That way you can sound like you know what you're talking about when you go looking for it. So that's enough of that. Today we are continuing our Around the Word in a Year series. Again, my apologies, it's coming out a little bit late, but again, this is a hobby of mine, and so videos are going to come out when they come out. Today we're covering Exodus 11 through 15. It's the story of the Passover, which includes the 10th and final plague. We covered the first 9 plagues in the beginning of Exodus last week, and then pushes on through the deliverance at the Red Sea. And what I thought was really important to include, maybe if you're following along, it's the first time you've read it, is the Song of Moses. And Miriam is in there as well. That song of rejoicing after being delivered by God. I think it's a really important part of the story. We really shouldn't stop with the people getting through to the other side of the Red Sea. That's great and all. Finish the story, right? The celebration, the reaction of the people. It's an important part. So include it when you're reading in Exodus, when you're reading through this account. But the way I see it, we have really two episodes that we could talk about. We could talk about the Passover and the 10th plague, or we could talk more about what happened after, once the Israelites had left through the crossing of the Red Sea. And I guess we're going to add a third episode of that celebration, because it does take on a different element. I've covered the Passover section a lot, personally, not on this channel. And so I'm less inclined to really spend some time on that, although there's amazing, amazing stuff there. And so what I would encourage you to do, if you haven't already, is practice. Practice biblical interpretation, particularly Old Testament typological interpretation, because the Passover just is riddled with typology. And if you haven't read the section already, do it while you're reading it. Maybe go back and read through the section on the Passover again and ask yourself, as often as you can remember, every verse if you need to, how is this about Jesus? How is this about Jesus? I promise you it is. How is this related to something that happened in the life of Christ? How is this related to his ministry? How is this related to his mission? How is this related to his death, his resurrection, and his work of salvation? You will see a lot. Huge amounts of connections. I mean, this is one of the major themes of Scripture is the Passover lamb, and specifically Christ being the Passover lamb, the fulfillment of the Passover. Great, great stuff. Don't want to really spend too much time on that today. What I'd like to spend my time on might be a little bit different, and is not actually originally what I think I'm going to talk more about something I hadn't originally planned on talking about. And it might seem strange, because I'm also not really going to talk about the crossing of the Red Sea, not even the pillar of smoke and fire, which blew my mind at seminary. The fire part could be translated lightning. And it was a pillar of lightning or fire by night, simply because they saw the lightning more at that point. You can think of almost like the electrical tornado sort of thing. And I've always thought that might be an interesting... That's always been my vision ever since hearing that the Hebrew probably is better rendered that way. Of course, I can't get the image of the column of literal fire from the Prince of Egypt out of my mind. I mean, the Prince of Egypt, for good and for ill, really colors the way I envision the entire Exodus account. There's a lot of good stuff in there. There's some stuff that's not quite so accurate, but it's a cartoon, and it is excellent. If you have not seen The Prince of Egypt, yeah, it's on Amazon. I don't know if it costs anything or if it's free. If you have Prime, go watch The Prince of Egypt. It is excellent. It is truly spectacular. But I don't even want to talk about that, even though I do think it is Jesus who's showing up in his pre-incarnate state, a Christophany, if you will. Just as it was Jesus at the burning bush. But I said I wasn't going to talk about that. What I want to talk about, and I don't necessarily need to get into to quoting it, is the section kind of in the middle where God is commanding the Israelites how they are to teach their children. Right, so we see this in the commands and the lessons about the Passover. It shows up more than once throughout the account. When your children ask, why are we doing this? Say this. And I want to spend a little bit of time on that, because there's a really neat lesson I think we can draw out from this about a broader topic that I think is going to be really good. It's good. I think it's growing on me already. It's good. I mean, I'm really enjoying the Glenmorangie. And that is this, that take notice of what the parents are to teach their children. It is how God delivered you, us, sometimes, out of Egypt. Yeah, this makes sense. The people who are coming out were literally the ones being delivered from Egypt. But this is to go on for generations and generations, even to today. The people of Israel, the descendants of Israel, even the literal descendants, the biological descendants down to this day, are to teach the Passover as if God has taken them out of Egypt. And yes, we have all sorts of wonderful Christological connections with that as well. But that's a strange way to think about things. At least, it struck me as strange when I first kind of saw this sort of thing happen. Because it happens a lot in the Old Testament, where God will do something and then the parents are to teach their children, right? When you see this pile of stones, teach your children, this is where God delivered us across the Jordan. We do this because of how God delivered us from Egypt. It's present tense. Yes, it happened to their ancestors, but that deliverance that God gave is for them as well. It is their deliverance, not just their ancestors' deliverance. And of course, as Christians, as the theological descendants of Abraham, as Paul talks about in Romans, the Exodus is where God delivered us from Egypt as well. You went with God through the Red Sea. You walked with him on dry land. You weren't there. Don't get me wrong, I don't think you were there or anything, but that deliverance was not just for them, it was for you as well. And this has all sorts of implications to the cross, right? You weren't there when Jesus died, and yet his death is for you. You are given the gifts that were earned on the cross. That deliverance is for you as well. Even though you weren't alive when it happened, it is for you as well. And it's really that phrase that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about. For you. Because I think there's confusion. There was for me as well. I really didn't like this when I was taught it. But once I kind of got over myself, it makes so much sense. It's so helpful. Particularly as a pastor, a preacher in particular. But it will be for those of you sitting in the pews as well. And that is, Lutherans often talk, I got my Lutheran shirt on, what, Lutheran 500, right? Lutherans often talk about the distinction between law and gospel, and we can talk a lot about law and gospel, but the short answer is that the law shows you your sin, and the gospel shows you your Savior, right? The SOS acronym shows our sins, shows our Savior, makes it easy to remember. And the law lays bare all that is within you, shows you that you cannot earn your own salvation, and the gospel shows you where your salvation comes from. Again, very simple explanation of law and gospel. But when it comes to preaching, and I'm going to give you this information really from the perspective of a preacher. That's what I do. That's a big part of my job, and it's a part that I've spent a lot of time really focusing on and trying to get better at. And I have no idea who it was. A professor at seminary mentioned, I don't even know if it was in a hom class. Hom is short for homiletics, which is the art of preaching. I don't even know if it was in one of those classes, but the professor told me that it is not gospel that Jesus died on the cross. Now, hold on. Hold on, we'll get there. It is not gospel that God delivered the people of Israel across the Red Sea. It's not gospel that God has done any of these things that are written in the Bible. It's not gospel, that's history. So if you're hearing a sermon and the pastor is talking all about Jesus dying on the cross, that's good. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely not bad. But that's not actually gospel. At least it's not proclaimed gospel, which is what preaching is all about. All that is history. That's something that happened in the past. Who cares? Again, that's a bit hyperbolic of me. But if all I'm telling you as a preacher is that Jesus died on the cross 2,000 years ago, half a world away, who cares? What does that matter to you? You don't live 2,000 years ago. You don't live half a world away. You've never met this Jesus guy. What does it matter? No, see, the gospel is more than just the statement of historical fact that Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead. Gospel is that Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead for you. You are the reason. It is done on your behalf. You receive the benefits of Jesus dying on the cross and rising from the dead. And there are tons of forms that this can take. In the sermon that I preached today, I'm filming this on Sunday. Jesus died on the cross. I didn't really talk too much about the cross, but that for you was in there. He took on the debt that you had, and he gave you his righteousness. See, it's not just a matter of when Jesus dies on the cross, he takes sinners' debt upon himself. That's all well and good. If it's not for you, who cares? But no, proclamation of gospel, true gospel in especially the sense of preaching, but in general as well, is that Jesus died on the cross to take your debt, yours, you who is watching this video. Applying it to Egypt, God delivered the people out of slavery for you. He delivered you out of slavery. You are the one who is leaving the land of Egypt to go into the promised land. You are the one leaving slavery to sin to enter into God's eternal rest. It's not gospel until it's about you. So I hope this is clear. When you're listening to preachers, listen for this, because I think it's one of those things that turns decent gospel. I'm never going to say that talking about Jesus dying on the cross is not gospel, right? It's a rhetorical tool that the professor used when he said that it wasn't gospel. But it's okay, gospel. But when it's about you, when those words, whether they show up or not, but when that is applied to you, that's what turns decent gospel into great gospel. That's what turns good gospel proclamation or decent gospel proclamation into real, good, true, saving gospel proclamation. So listen for it when you are listening to sermons. Even in Bible classes, this sort of thing should be happening. Won't always. Bible classes are different. They're not proclamation of law and gospel. They can have that. They should have that to an extent. But Bible classes are different. But when you're hearing preaching, you're not getting good gospel unless the gospel is for you. Again, you don't have to use those words. You can say, just as God took the Israelites out of Egypt, so too does he take you out of the land of slavery. That's for you. That has been applied to you. It's not general. There's no doubt as to who that gospel is going towards, who that gospel is for. But listen for it. Sometimes it can be hard to hear. And quite frankly, if it's hard to hear that the gospel is for you, it's not good gospel. Not a great sermon. I don't care how inspired you are. I don't care how great the speaker was. If you don't walk away from that sermon having heard the gospel and that the gospel is for you, it wasn't a good sermon. Now, you also could have not been listening. That's always a possibility here. But as a preacher, I don't allow that to be an excuse. I need to do my job, and I just need to do it such that you hear the gospel and you hear that it is for you. I'm not perfect. I don't do it all the time, and I might be scared to do this. I know a number of my members, in fact, mostly my members are the ones watching this, at least at this point, in the channel. But pay attention, and I give you permission until I revoke that permission to call me out. If I don't give gospel for you and I don't apply the gospel to you, let me know. You can come out and say, Pastor Berlinski, you gave me a lot of history in that sermon. There's no gospel. You didn't tell me how I receive it. You don't tell me how I fit in. You can call me out. You might want to be a bit more tactful if you're not one of my members and you recognize that your pastor's not doing this. It's tough. It's really easy just to say, well, if I mention that Jesus died on the cross, that's gospel. It's not. I mean, it is, kind of. But it's not really gospel unless it's for you. While we're on this soapbox of mine about proclamation of the gospel, completely aside from everything we talked about in Exodus, I need to mention something because it's really irritating to me when it happens. It happens a lot. Not necessarily in my circles. It happens a lot on the radio is really where I personally have experienced this. The pastor will be preaching on the radio, and he's walking you towards that gospel, right? He's already crushed you with the law. Radio preachers are really good at destroying you with the law. They're excellent at that. Because, we can study. I can learn from them. I have tried to. I get too frustrated most of the time to watch these guys, to listen to these guys for too long. They're excellent preachers of the law. And then they start walking towards the gospel. They're talking about Jesus, they're talking about his work, talking about maybe even what he did on the cross. That'd be a great sermon. And then right before they say Jesus died for you to forgive your sin, they say something along the lines of Jesus died on the cross so that you can now live a better life. That's not gospel. That's not even bad gospel. That is straight up law. That is a confusion of law and gospel. If you do this as a pastor, stop it. Not only because it really irritates me. I don't listen to sermons when there are other people in the car because I yell a lot when this sort of thing happens. But if you are a pastor who preaches sermons that sound like that, you are sinning against your congregation. I have no qualms in saying that. If you turn the gospel into something they have to do, you are sinning against them. And you're going to have to answer for that one day. No, the gospel has no work of anyone in there. And no, the gospel is not the thing that gives you the ability to be better. Absolutely not. Now, there's a place for third use of the law. Trust me, I've done a lot of third use of the law stuff. It's an area that I spent time trying to really hone and get in. Well, and I don't know, I think I fall off on one way or the other with that one frequently. I don't think there's anything wrong with ending a sermon on law. Right? Now that Jesus has done all this for you, act better, right? Be a better person. Not because it's going to save you, but because Jesus has already died for you. And now you as a Christian can actually do this sort of thing. So stop sinning. Very, very kind of blanket statement there. But this is a personal frustration of mine. It's a thing that raises my blood pressure. Again, I whenever I hear a preacher on the radio, I listen to them. And I usually, almost always, I can't think of a time off the top of my head that I don't end up getting really irritated because these guys lead you up, and they're so good at it too. They're such great speakers, and it makes it even worse that they get to the point of the gospel and then they just crush you back down into the grave of the law. It's awful. It's really a horrible thing that they do. People eat it up because people want to do something for their salvation. People want to justify themselves. It's the deepest, hardest sin to root out is the attempts and the desire to justify yourself. Look throughout history. Every time something has gone wrong in the church, it is because people have tried to justify themselves or found a way to, if not justify themselves, start the process of justifying themselves. If this sounds familiar to my members, I absolutely railed on that idea this morning in my sermon in a very different way. But that sense of self-justification, I hammer on it a lot. I think it's one of the great deep-seated sins. I've heard one pastor, I don't know if I'd go as far as he would. He says that is what the flesh is. When Paul talks about the flesh, all that is the desire to justify yourself. Maybe. I don't know enough about the topic to really come down hard on that. And the guy who said it is a very smart person. He's a very intelligent individual, and I know he's got his law and gospel stuff down. He is I'm a great confessional Lutheran pastor. I'm not going to tell you who he is because he does a lot of other things that really irritate me. But he is someone who's been fairly influential for how I think theologically. So if you know me or if you want, you can email me and maybe we can have a conversation about who this guy is and where you can see the good stuff that he's put out. Because he's put some stuff out that so frustrating. I don't listen to him anymore. I will put it that way. Gotten far afield, rambling. That's part of what this channel is for, right? My theology brain dump, particularly on the gospel. And if you're one of my members and you did not know that I have this massive irritation about bad preachers, and again, when I say bad preachers, I don't mean boring preachers. I mean, they're just bad speakers. They can be really good preachers and horrible speakers. On the other hand, they can be amazing rhetoricians. They can be spectacular speakers and just awful preachers. They're not synonymous. Now, being a good speaker helps because it helps get the message across, right? If you're a monotone drone as a preacher, you can have the best content in the world, but it's going to be so hard for people to actually hear what you're saying. So even if you're hitting home runs every week, work on your technique. That's important as well. The way you deliver content matters. It's not the end all be all. It's not the biggest contender for what matters, but it does. I'll end with this so that I can ramble a little bit more before I finish up. With my confirmation students, I talk about them a lot. My confirmation students are great. And I just love teaching confirmation. But as part of the confirmation program, I have them doing sermon reviews. But it doesn't, as far as I know, no one else does sermon reviews like how I have them doing them. I don't ask them to outline the sermon in any way. What I ask is for the answer to 4 questions. What is the text that the pastor is preaching on? I make it very easy because I start all my sermons by saying, this is today's text. The guy I work with, he doesn't do that, and sometimes he jumps around, so it's always fun when he preaches and I get a sermon review from him because sometimes the kids know exactly what he was talking about and sometimes they just miss it. Not his fault, they're middle schoolers, it happens. Not their fault either, right? It's just the way it is. They're learning how to do it. But I do tell them that if they get mine wrong, we got a problem. This is like the second thing I say to them is what text I'm preaching on. And I do that for 2 reasons. One, it's how the guys that were my pastors when I was growing up introduced their sermons. So that's what I grew up with. But 2, I do it so that you listening can go look to the text. Man, I'm really going to just go on a diatribe on preaching. Because you should be preaching what's in the text, right? You should take the gospel of the text and the law of the text and apply it into the sermon. It's not wrong, but it's a little inappropriate and kind of weird to just do your own thing with the gospel or with the law. I had a good example. So we did the parable of the unmerciful servant. That was the text for today's sermon. And it'd be one thing to, there's a lot of law in there, right? I preached in a different way, right? I talked about self-justification with it. Because I think the servant was trying to justify himself when he was loaning money out to the other servants. But that's neither here nor there. But if you're going to use that text and all of a sudden start talking about like marital unfaithfulness or gambling addiction, you're just preaching what you want to preach. And that's not, why have the text, right? If you really want to do that, go off the lectionary. Or just pick your text. I don't think you should. I think the lectionary is good for a reason. And even if you're not using the lectionary, have a series. That way you are bound to a text. And you don't get to just pick out whatever you want to talk about. But it's got to match the text, right? So that's the first question I have my confirmation students answer is what was the text of the sermon? Even though I don't have them matching law and gospel, that's a level or 2 up from where I'm guessing they are, even though they've surprised me a lot recently, so they might be able to do more than I make them, but I don't want to make the requirements any harder. So the first question is, what is the text? Second question is name one example of law in the sermon. Essentially, and the first thing I do is I teach them the law and gospel. But essentially, what is something that convicts you, that makes you feel convicted, hurt, harmed, that you cannot stand before the face of God? That's the law. Give me one example. Often there'll be a lot of law in a sermon. Third, what was the gospel? Give me one example of a gospel thing that you heard. Presumably the law and the gospel should be somewhat connected. I'm ranting enough. And then last is, give me a take home. How is this going to apply to your life in any way? And the main reason I'm doing this is to teach them that what makes a good sermon good is law and gospel. It's not presentation, it's not flashy lights, it's not any of that. It is whether there's law and gospel. And also this helps me check to make sure they're getting law and gospel. Every once in a while, I'll get a sermon review back where the student has said that the gospel is, now that Jesus died for me, I can live a better life. Well, I hope you do, but that's not gospel, right? That's 30s of the law. And it gives me an opportunity to kind of teach and correct that. I also tell my students that they don't have to review our sermons. I've never had anyone do an outside sermon. But I've told them, any preacher anywhere on the face of the planet, they can review. But I do say if it's not one of ours, let me know if there's an online version. That way I can watch the sermon. I can do the sermon review. That way I know if they're getting it or not. That was far too much ranting for today. But hopefully you have a better appreciation of law and gospel. Pay attention to the preaching. You don't necessarily need to just call your pastor out to the carpet, although I have given you permission. By the way, Rivercliff folks, that's permission from me. That doesn't go for both of us. For the other pastor I work with. You can call me out on this. And again, that's an open invitation until it really gets on my nerves. Although, quite frankly, if it gets on my nerves, it means I need to be doing a better job. So maybe there'll be some repentance if it starts getting bad in that sense. But anyway, those who wait on the Lord, raise a glass and let us drink Christ's imminent return. Cheers.